Hey everyone, now this presentation talks about two of the assigned readings this week. They come from JSTOR, which is a database on Troy's library site. You go to, I have a link that'll take you to the database page, but you can go to the Global Campus Library. There's a list of things. They have databases. You click on databases and click on J. There's a bazillion of them. But you want the JSTOR Arts and Sciences collection. You click on that puppy, log in with your Troy Web Express ID. Boom, you're into a wonderful data set that gives you access to journal articles, just all over the place. It's awesome. Well, from my academic point of view. Anyway, I do have some hints online about how you can search for it, and in case they're not there for some reason, I say with JSTOR, the best thing to do is once you get into it, you click on there's a little search box, and under it there's a link for the advanced search. You go into the advanced search, and then the easiest way to find something, I think, is you search for the author in the first field. So you put the author's name, and then you toggle, there's a little box to the right that says it defaults to full text. You toggle on that, and you can say, no, search for author. And then, that's the first field. There's a second search field. You can add more, but really the second field, I just pick a keyword from the title. That's guaranteed to be in there somewhere. You could toggle to title, but usually at this point we're ready to hit search, and you'll probably get a reasonable number with the article you're looking for, a reasonable number of hits with the article you're looking for. And then you can read it online, and you can download it as a PDF, which is usually what I do. I download that puppy. Anyway, so we got two of these things, and these are journal articles. These are scholarly journal articles that were published, and they are going to talk about, they're meant to go to the question of how do you cross-examine data, how do you analyze just one set of facts. So we're not into full empirical stuff that's the norm in political science, but, what do we got? So I have two articles here, Search for the Breaking Point Vietnam and Pearl Harbor, Military Inconvenience, Political Disaster, that I think go to this question. Now the author in this case, and you get a lot from John Mueller. John Mueller he was a professor at the University of Rochester, where I went. He was my professor. I put this nice pretty picture of him up here, and not the picture I have of him at a barbecue with his big plate and a floppy hat, as much because that's from the 90s and it's on paper. But he was a guy, he was also on my dissertation committee. But John, the thing about John, he had this interesting characteristic. He would question things. He would ask the question that you wouldn't think to ask. And I remember reading that one of the complaints about Socrates in Aristotle's writings about him, there's a frequent complaint that Socrates, you always make the weaker argument the stronger. And darn it, your analysis and logic. This was John Mueller. He always made the weaker argument the stronger, and so you really had to cowboy up when you talk to him. And it comes through in a lot of his writings as he questions things. And the two articles that we have here, and by the way, we'll see him again in this course. Unless I change the course, but don't change this video. But we'll probably see him again because his research on public opinion in Vietnam, that's what that established him as a scholar. And that's pretty good because it's accessible. It doesn't use cray-cray advanced empirical techniques. And so we're going to see a lot of John simply because what he writes is, I think, very accessible. But he's, these are published things, and he's a good scholar, but he just really does question, hey, these folks have said this. Is that true? Can we look at this and think about, can we in some way get some data to test whether or not this is true? And when I knew him, the first Gulf War occurred, and I was at Rochester at the time, and after it was done, he was just like, was there a war? Was there any fighting? And he was, going around, and that just pissed me off because I was still in the National Guard, and I had the buzzed hair. And so I had to feed him these Army Times articles about the couple battles that did occur. But he just wasn't going to accept things on face value. And to a certain extent, I think that's a really good characteristic to have a little bit of. And so this is why we have some of his articles. Okay, the first article he had is a search for the breaking point in Vietnam. And now I want you to read these on your own, but I kind of also want to give you an understanding of why I'm having you read it and what I want you to get out of it. In Search for the Breaking Point in Vietnam, this is a really very straightforward, it is an empirical work. I mean, the whole thing is, and John is rooted in empirical, in the empirical world. He doesn't really do much with theory, which is one reason I didn't have him for that many classes, because I was a big theorist. But he's very interested in, kind of, all right, what's going on here? And so he notes that in Vietnam, the idea that Westmoreland had was that, we could attrite the Vietnamese and break them, right? And this was something that comes up. And if you read about Vietnam, that's more or less, a common theme is, the idea that the U.S. was tracking how many Vietnamese they were killing and thinking that they could, outlast, it was like a 10-to-1 advantage. And so surely the Vietnamese will break. And they apparently don't. And so Mueller's like, well, let's look at this. Why didn't this happen? Why didn't they break? And so he basically goes in and says, most of this paper comes down to one fact, one little variable, if you will. How many Vietnamese were killed in the war? How many, if the U.S. was trying to break them, to get them to, to attrite them to the point where they would lose their will to fight and want to, make peace, well, okay, the central question is, how many people did the U.S. kill? And so Vietnamese battle deaths are this one variable. And Mueller goes in, and the paper's broken up. First, he tries to get a number. And so a lot of the paper is devoted to measuring one variable, Vietnamese battle deaths, as, the result of the U.S. war, of the U.S. actions. And so he goes in, and what's interesting here is he goes in and looks at the data, and he ends up kind of coming to the conclusion that for all the documented cases of and all the idea that body counts by the U.S. military were inflated, he figures out that, well, no, actually, when we think in terms of the total war and we're thinking in large numbers, total population, U.S. body counts were actually more or less dead on. And with understanding more or less, at this point, there's a plus or minus hundreds of thousands. But more or less, this is, which is, I think, kind of interesting. Here we have something that is legendarily flawed in its collection, right? Totally unreliable. It depends on estimates of commanders, and there's political there's internal institutional pressure on them to inflate these things. Yet at the end of the day, when we add them all up, it looks like they were nevertheless a fair indicator of how many folks were killed. So that's one section, and read that to see what you think. The next thing is he takes that and he says, all right, let's look at, what percentage of the Vietnamese population this was. And then let's compare that percentage to what happened to other countries in other wars. And so he goes to databases and does a comparison of that number to others, and to get a sense of, okay, that many people, what's that mean, right? And the conclusion there is, whoa, or wow, as I wrote here. The Vietnamese went to the wall. They suffered more casualties. There's only a couple small wars where people suffered higher levels of casualties, and they certainly suffered significantly more than, say, the Japanese did in World War II. And, so really the Vietnamese bled, and the U.S. bled the Vietnamese tremendously. And, and then after looking at that, he goes into a very lengthy conclusion. Well, what's this mean, right? And he has, and he kind of says Westmoreland, maybe his strategy wasn't so bad because based on the recorded history, it probably should have worked, but it didn't. And John then starts, I think, kind of questioning, was there a breaking point? And so he goes on. And the third thing I think you look at here is he spends a lot of time, a substantial part of the paper is basically what I'm calling conclusions, where he's with this one little factoid about deaths, and that the fact that they were bigger than most recorded history, that provides him a leverage to make 10, 12 pages of conclusion. And the question there is, how well does he stick to using that point, I suppose. But this is what I think is interesting. This is a paper where we measure one variable, we compare it, and he gets says a lot of interesting things. So the takeaway from that article, the first one, is one, the value of cross-examining, look at the data, and again, John questions what people know. And so it's not surprising that he will, at the end of the day, be willing to consider a measure, U.S. body counts, that are, just out of hand rejected by people. But he cross-examines it. He looks at it. Is this about right? Does this fit what the Vietnamese said happened? Does this fit with population statistics? He does a lot of things to try and say, does this number hold water? And so I think that's important. We get that hard kernel, the fact that the Vietnamese suffer more battle deaths as a percentage of their population than almost everybody else. I think that hard kernel is something you put in your pocket and you use that all the time. I do remember when during the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein, the first one, was saying, we'll wear out the Americans like the Vietnamese did. And I had this in my head, and I'm like, really? You think you can do that? Most people couldn't. In history, it's one of these things. It makes you recognize that this is not something that's likely to occur because it is that different. So the hard kernel, it can be used in different ways, and I think it's a very important one. And so I think this is a great example of what I'm talking about, the one little piece in there that you take with you. But then you have all of his conclusions, many, many pages of inferences, which you don't have to buy. You should consider. He's got a basis for them. But, I think it draws a big distinction between the hard kernel of empirical truth, the empirical result, and then the conclusions that are made on it. But it also shows how much you can get out of something. And he really does have a lot of conclusions there. So that's something to look at. Okay, the next article is Pearl Harbor, Military Inconvenience, Political Disaster. I've been more scrupulous about having the whole title on this one because the other one, it was too long. This article, to be honest, I almost didn't have this one in here, but I went ahead and put it in as a second example. In this article, John Mueller, again, questioning what people say. I think he just read one too many discussion of Pearl Harbor as a catastrophe, a disaster. from scholarly people who he thinks should know better, and he says, well, was this really a disaster? And and I don't know the story. I mean, it was published while I was there at Rochester with him, but I didn't talk to him extensively about why he decided to do it. But it's very fitting that in his character, and I think in the character of a scholar, to say, wait a minute. And this article, I think, would have been better for our purposes from a methodological point of view if he had spent more time fully operationalizing the concept of disaster or catastrophe. In the article, he sort of does it. He kind of implicitly does it, where he says, here are disasters, catastrophes. He says, what would an actual disaster look like? And he doesn't spend that time. He just kind of shows ways that Pearl Harbor, the loss for the U.S., wasn't as bad as the name seems to imply. I think this would have been better if he'd, because you can look at what he wrote and you can see what he's thinking, that, for something to be a disaster, it has to be a significant percentage of your forces, or it has to be something that seriously affects your ability to conduct military operations in the future. There's a lot of interesting ways you could say, well, what do we mean by disaster or catastrophe? What are the characteristics of such a thing? For something to qualify, what would the characteristics have to be? And I mentioned two of them there. And he then, looks at it. And so it's implicit here. And that's something that, again, this is one reason why, I vacillate as to whether this is a good article for you all, but let me throw it out there and let me suggest that you read it and think about, all right, how could you have operationalized disaster? How would that have helped the analysis? How would that have focused it a bit? And we see again that John, he's basically goes through and he says, finds all the things, there weren't that many ships lost. It really didn't affect the ability going forward because there wasn't an ability there to begin with. You really couldn't have gone steaming off to the rescue of the Philippines. Even if you had the ships that were lost at Pearl Harbor. And in fact, U.S. war plans, U.S. planners had no anticipation of doing this. And so he brings up all the reasons that really, at the end of the day, it really wasn't a big impairment for for the U.S. war effort. Not really casting much of a operational shadow over things. And all right, that's interesting. And I think it is interesting to see, all the lists of things that he has in there that, it really does change your thinking, I think, on it. But then a lot of the paper goes into what I would call speculation about counterfactuals, because he says, well, it might have also been a political disaster. And there's some empirical stuff in there. The hard kernel, and this is the key question you come out of this, is where is the hard kernel? The line here, to my mind, is not as clearly drawn as it is in Search for the Breaking Point, between where he's sticking to the facts and then kind of going off into more of a discussion of, well, this could have happened and that could have happened. And there's some very serious, potentially controversial things. I think the idea that it's a military inconvenience, that's, that it sounds odd to put that on such a one-sided loss, but, in a lot of ways, I think he makes the case. The fact that it's a political disaster for the Japanese, I think that's pushing on an open door. His discussion of potential, what else the U.S. could have done against Japan. Would the U.S. have pursued a Cold War strategy against the Japanese if they had not, in fact, attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, by the way, in some ways, I do think, I just have to throw out there, when I read that, I'm like, well, sure, they didn't, they attacked Pearl Harbor, that pissed us off. I think we would have been pissed when the Philippines got taken, because that was still U.S. territory. And the Bataan Death March, might have incurred ire as well. And so I think the attack on the Philippines, the thing about Pearl Harbor is our memorials are in Hawaii, not the Philippines. Might be another thing there. But see what you think. I don't know. The key question is, where's the hard kernel? And where's the empirical result that you can take from this? And also, like I say, it's just another good example of, people get into saying things, and sometimes we have to look at the data and question. Kind of like I have people, when people say America's manufacturing has declined, I'm like, really, has it? Actually our output keeps increasing. It's just we don't employ that many people in it. We're more productive and things are automated, and so there are, millions less jobs in manufacturing. So what does that mean? That's the kind of thing where I think that, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get people, what I'm trying to get your head around, or get you in the direction of, hey, when we have these facts or things that people know about the world, can we subject them to tests and find out some other greater nuances of meaning? Okay, so I hope these articles help you in that direction. I hope you can see how they fit, and that it gets you kind of in the mood to cross-examine data in the future.